My name is Rachel, and I had been married to Daniel for 17 years. 17 long, often bewildering years. On the surface, we were the quintessential suburban couple. He, a respected accountant with a knack for silent judgments, and me, a former graphic designer who had traded creative chaos for a life of neat domestic order. We lived in a cozy, colonial-style home on a tree-lined cul-de-sac in Westbridge, the kind of neighborhood where front lawns were mowed to perfection and everyone waved whether they liked you or not. Our house was a blend of beige walls, polite conversations, and carefully curated appearances. We had polite neighbors who hosted wine nights and block parties. We attended, smiled, and always brought a side dish. It all looked so perfect from the outside. But perfection, I've come to learn, is often just a well-staged lie. Behind closed doors, our marriage had settled into a routine so suffocating it could strangle joy without leaving a mark. We had grown used to silence, to the unspoken tension that clung to the air like humidity in July. Daniel had a way of looking right through me, especially when I expressed a need or voiced a concern. He would nod absently, say something like, "We'll talk about it later," and then later would never come. I stopped asking eventually. It wasn't worth the hollow answers. And then, of course, there was Margaret. Ah, yes. His mother. The ever-present shadow in my life. Margaret was not a mother-in-law. Margaret was an institution. A force. A sharp-eyed matriarch with pearl earrings and a tongue dipped in poison. She was a master of the backhanded compliment, the kind of woman who could make you feel inferior with a smile and a passive-aggressive quip. "You have such a creative way of keeping house," she'd say, eyes scanning my kitchen like she was judging entries in a county fair. Daniel always loved a home-cooked meal. She once added pointedly, as I pulled takeout from a brown paper bag after working late on a freelance project. From the very beginning, she'd made it clear that I wasn't good enough for her precious son. I was too different, too modern, too artistic. She referred to my old design studio as your little hobby until I shut it down entirely, partly out of fatigue, partly because Daniel had gently hinted it was time to focus on the household. "We can always use the extra space," he'd said. "And besides, you never seemed that happy doing it." I hadn't been unhappy. I'd been tired. I'd been unsupported. There's a difference. And Daniel never once corrected her. Not when she belittled my cooking, or questioned my decor, or criticized the way I folded the napkins at Thanksgiving. He would smile, uncomfortable but silent, sipping his wine and letting her words settle like dust over everything we built. Or perhaps I should say, everything I built. Our relationship, if you could call it that, was a cold war of manners. I tolerated her presence during holidays and birthdays. She pretended I didn't exist outside those days, but over the years, her visits grew longer and more frequent. A few days at Christmas became a week. Easter? She insisted on hosting it in our home, our home. Then came the summer visits, a month at a time. She'd take Daniel's study as her own private retreat, redecorate without asking, and complain about how exhausting it was to manage things in her condition, though she walked 5 miles a day and played competitive bridge twice a week. Daniel never objected. In fact, he encouraged them. "She's lonely," he'd say. "She's aging and needs us." But I knew better. Margaret wasn't the helpless widow she pretended to be. She thrived on control. She manipulated with precision, guilt, and subtle threats of martyrdom. And Daniel? He was too spineless to challenge her, or perhaps too blind to see the damage she was causing. Either way, I was left to pick up the pieces, smiling through clenched teeth, making tea, nodding at veiled insults, while my identity slowly eroded beneath a tide of forced civility. I used to think this was just the way marriages worked. That compromise meant swallowing your needs, your wants, your voice, until what was left was a version of you even your reflection didn't recognize. I played the part so well that I nearly convinced myself I was happy. I kept the home in order, hosted book club, planned birthday parties. I even developed a knack for masking my resentment in pastel colors and Pinterest-perfect meals. But something began to shift in me a few years ago. It started small. I found my old sketchbooks while cleaning the attic. I sat on the floor for hours, flipping through pages of forgotten ideas, half-formed dreams, and messy, passionate visions that once thrilled me. I'd been someone once, a woman with a perspective, with opinions and ambition. I cried that night, quietly, afraid Daniel or the children would hear. That's when I started journaling again. Just a few lines a day. At first, it was harmless, a release valve, a place to breathe. But over time, my thoughts grew bolder, my anger clearer. I began to trace the contours of my own silencing. Each page became a mirror, one that refused to flatter. I began to see what I had become, a woman who had traded her voice for the illusion of peace. And then came the day everything changed. The day of our 17th wedding anniversary. That morning, I woke early. I remember standing in front of the bathroom mirror, toothbrush in hand, staring at my reflection, and wondering when exactly the spark had disappeared from my eyes. I adjusted the necklace Daniel had given me on our 10th anniversary. A delicate piece of gold and emeralds, beautiful but hollow, like most of his gestures. I hadn't worn it in over a year, but it felt symbolic to put it on that day, like closing a circle. The house was quiet, the way it always was before Margaret arrived. I descended the stairs, expecting the usual. Coffee brewing, silence, maybe a perfunctory kiss on the cheek. But instead, the house was filled with the scent of roses, hundreds of them, bouquets arranged on every surface like a mausoleum of forgotten affection. The dining table was set with fine china, a catered brunch being laid out by two strangers in white gloves. And there, in the middle of it all, stood Margaret. Regal as ever in a tailored lavender dress and pearls, her hair lacquered into submission. She looked like she was posing for a portrait that no one had commissioned. "Happy anniversary, darling," she said, her voice dripping with a false sweetness that made my stomach twist. Daniel followed behind, looking nervous, his smile too tight, too rehearsed. He kissed my cheek and gestured at the spread like a magician revealing a trick. "Surprise! We wanted to do something special." Something about the way he said "we" made my blood run cold. I smiled, polite and frozen. How fleisch? Thoughtful. It was in that moment that I knew. Something was coming. I could feel it in my bones, the way animals sense storms. Daniel's eyes wouldn't quite meet mine. Margaret was practically vibrating with satisfaction. Whatever this was, it wasn't about celebration. It was about declaration, about control, about a new chapter, one I hadn't agreed to write. The entire morning passed in a surreal haze of forced laughter, toasts made with mimosas, and conversations that skated over years of unspoken resentment. At one point, Margaret handed me a gift box. "Open it!" she urged, eyes gleaming. Inside was a pamphlet for a luxury assisted living facility. For her ***. But it wasn't an admission. It was a brochure she had * designed, for *me to review. "I think it's time we start planning ahead," she said calmly, sipping her tea. "You know, for when Daniel's ready to take over my finances and estate full-time. You'll be helping, of course." The implication was clear. She was never leaving, not unless she was carried out. I looked at Daniel. He said nothing. That was the moment something inside me snapped. Or maybe it bloomed. Not a scream or a fight. No, it was quieter than that. A shift. A click. The realization that I was done performing. That this wasn't my prison unless I let it be. I didn't say anything that day. Not yet. But I started making plans. Because that day, our 17th wedding anniversary, wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of my beginning. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do yet, but I knew this. I was going to reclaim everything they had tried to take from me. My voice, my space, myself, and God help anyone who stood in my way. The dining room was crowded with people who barely knew us. Daniel had invited coworkers, neighbors, and a few of his golf buddies, the kind of people who wore polo shirts in winter and spoke in acronyms. I recognized maybe half the faces. None of them truly knew me. I doubted they even realized this was our anniversary, let alone our 17th. To them, it was another suburban gathering, another excuse for catered lamb bites and wine that cost just enough to impress. I weaved between conversations with trays of hors d'oeuvres, like a waitress at a party I hadn't been invited to. My smile was pleasant, practiced. I had learned to fade into the background gracefully, like wallpaper. Not out of meekness, no. It was strategic. If they didn't notice me, they couldn't see me watching. Daniel had been unusually chipper all afternoon, shaking hands and laughing a little too loudly. His laugh grated at me. It used to be one of the things I loved, soft, easy, warm. But lately, it had become something else, hollow, public-facing. A sound scrubbed clean of sincerity. Margaret sat perched on the armchair at the head of the room like it was a throne, draped in deep burgundy silk and her usual air of condescension. People came to her in waves, like pilgrims paying respect. She smiled with all the smug serenity of a queen mother whose reign had never truly ended. I moved quietly through the crowd, nodding at polite strangers. Two of Daniel's coworkers were talking near the fireplace, men I'd seen at last year's holiday party. One of them nudged the other and said, "Man, he's really got it all, doesn't he? Good job, beautiful house, perfect wife." I blinked, then I smiled and handed them stuffed mushrooms without saying a word. Perfect wife. I suppose I played that part well enough. It was all surface level. A stage play, the perfect marriage, the perfect family, the perfect home. But beneath the sparkle of glassware and the hum of small talk, I could feel the tension buzzing beneath my skin. I had seen the look Daniel gave Margaret earlier that morning. The look that said, "It's time." I didn't yet know what that meant, but I could feel its shape forming in the silence between their glances. After dinner, salmon with a citrus glaze, courtesy of the caterers, and a round of awkward toasts in which no one actually mentioned me by name, Daniel stood up. He tapped his glass with a spoon, sending a high, clear note through the room. Conversations faded, chairs shifted. All eyes turned toward him. He cleared his throat. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice warm and rehearsed. "I know most of you are busy, and it means a lot that you're here to celebrate with us today." A few guests murmured appreciatively. Daniel glanced at Margaret and smiled. 17 years. That's quite a journey. Polite laughter. I sipped my wine, waiting. His hands trembled slightly as he held the glass. "I have an announcement," he said, brightening. "My mother, Margaret, will be moving in with us permanently." There was a beat of silence, then polite applause, confused murmurs. A few cheers from the neighbors, who'd seen too many family sitcoms. My ears began to ring. "She's been spending more time with us lately, as many of you know," Daniel continued, still smiling. "And we realized, it just makes sense. She's getting older, and this way, we can all be together. A true family home." I felt cold. Not just annoyed or surprised, cold. The kind of cold that starts in your bones and spreads outward. I stared at him, trying to process what I'd just heard. Margaret's eyes sparkled. She leaned in toward the woman beside her, Doris from the garden club, and stage whispered, "Daniel's finally doing what's right. I suppose that means I can redecorate the master suite." I turned to Daniel. "The master suite?" He looked at me for the first time since standing up. His expression faltered. He cleared his throat. "Mom thinks it might be better if she takes our room. It's closer to the bathroom and her knees. Her knees aren't great lately. Just practical, really." I didn't hear the rest. I couldn't. His voice blurred into the background, drowned out by the thundering beat of my heart. The party was still going, still clinking and chatting and pretending, but I was outside of it now, floating, disconnected. There it was, laid bare in the open, for everyone to see. The betrayal, the insult, the utter disregard. Not just for me as a person, but for our entire life together. They didn't even have the decency to pretend this was a decision I'd been involved in. I had become a spectator in my own marriage, an obstacle to be managed rather than a partner to be heard. Margaret smirked at me. not a smile. A smirk dot asterisk asterisk. The kind that says, asterisk you lost. The kind that says, asterisk, you never stood a chance. She'd been chipping away at my place in this house for years. A vase replaced, a favorite painting accidentally taken down, her china in asterisk my asterisk cabinets. And now, the final move, the master suite. A full invasion. I looked around the room. Not one face met my eyes. The neighbors continued sipping their wine, oblivious. Daniel's colleagues went back to comparing bonuses. Even Doris just nodded along with Margaret, probably charmed by her elegant cruelty. And then, something strange happened. I smiled. It surprised even me, that smile. It wasn't born from politeness or survival. It was a smile born of clarity, of power. Because in that moment, I saw them all for what they were, actors, playing parts in a play I hadn't auditioned for. And I realized something else. They had no idea what was coming. Let them celebrate. Let them raise their glasses and toast their tidy little world. Because I had a plan of my own. It hadn't been fully formed until that moment. But now, standing there with my wine in hand, and Daniel's betrayal ringing in my ears, it came together with startling precision. I would not fight them head on. That's what they expected. Margaret would thrive in that chaos. She'd turn any resistance into proof that I was unstable, ungrateful. She'd win the sympathy of Daniel and the rest of the world. She always did. No. I would do this my way, quietly, strategically, like ink spreading through water, slow, invisible at first, but unstoppable. I finished my wine, set the glass down, and excused myself from the room. No one followed. No one noticed. In the kitchen, I leaned against the marble counter, closed my eyes, and took a deep breath. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from control. There was a fire in me now, not rage. Asterisk, asterisk, resolve dot asterisk, asterisk. I would not beg to stay in my own home. I would not plead for respect from a man who had forgotten how to see me. Instead, I would reclaim my life piece by piece. That night, after the guests had left and Daniel had collapsed into bed, our bed for now, I sat in the downstairs office with my journal. I wrote down everything, not just what had happened, but what I felt, what I knew, what I planned. Asterisk step 1. Information. If Margaret was moving in permanently, she'd bring more than just her wardrobe. She would bring paperwork, prescriptions, accounts. I would learn everything, not because I wanted to help, but because knowledge is leverage. Asterisk step 2. Finances. Daniel handled our money, or rather, he thought he did. But I had access. I always had. I just hadn't used it. Now I would. I would track every account, every withdrawal, every insurance policy. I'd create digital copies and hide them where only I could find them. I didn't know yet what I'd need. But I would be ready when the time came. Asterisk step 3. Identity. I would find myself again. Not the ghost version, the real one. The Rachel who once designed bold, chaotic, beautiful things. I would start freelancing again. Quietly. Under a new name if I had to. I would make money, build something that was mine, and prepare for the day I walked out of this house without looking back. Margaret wanted the master suite? Fine, let her have it. Because I wasn't planning to stay in this house much longer. But before I left, I would make sure I wasn't leaving empty-handed. Let Daniel sleep beside the woman who raised him to be a coward. Let Margaret measure curtains and order new wallpaper. Let them enjoy their little victory. They had no idea that the real war had just begun. And this time, I wasn't going to lose. 3 months ago, I began laying the groundwork. Call it intuition. Call it a lifetime of reading between the lines. But I had known deep down that Daniel and Margaret were planning something. The whispers, the late-night phone calls, the way they both shut up the moment I walked into a room. I'd learned to stop asking questions and start preparing. For years, I had quietly paid attention while pretending not to care. People like Daniel and Margaret thrived on being underestimated. They mistook silence for submission, and that was their first mistake. My silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. It started simply enough. One evening, after Daniel had gone to bed and Margaret was away for one of her mysterious spa weekends, likely just a gossip-laden getaway with her equally venomous sisters, I logged into our joint financial accounts. Daniel had always insisted on managing the money, and for years I had let him. It wasn't laziness. It was calculated. I knew that when the time came, he would underestimate my knowledge. He didn't think I was capable of deception. He still saw me as the agreeable wife who would never rock the boat. Big mistake. What I found in our accounts didn't surprise me, just disappointed me. Marginal savings, unnecessary subscriptions, donations to organizations I'd never heard of. Margaret's name was on several transactions. Of course it was. So I made a few changes, quietly, slowly. I created a separate account in my maiden name and funneled small amounts into it each week. I canceled the credit cards Margaret used and told Daniel the bank suspected fraud. He didn't ask questions. Why would he? He was too busy planning his takeover of my life to notice me reclaiming it. Then I found a buyer for the house. Her name was Donna Reynolds, a shrewd, no-nonsense woman with a passion for vintage properties and an eye for investment. I met her through Marianne, a friend from my old design firm who now worked in real estate. Donna fell in love with the house during the first walkthrough. She called it a charming colonial with just enough edge to make it interesting. I told her it came with a garden full of history and ghosts. She laughed and offered cash, and just like that, the paperwork began. It hadn't been hard to transfer the deed into my name alone. Daniel had signed it over the previous year for what he thought were tax reasons. It was Margaret's idea, actually. She had read something about spousal exemptions and insisted Daniel follow her accountant friend's advice. I just smiled and played along. "It's all just paperwork, Rachel," Daniel had said. "You know I handle the real decisions." Exactly. So, 3 weeks before the anniversary party, I finalized the sale. Donna wired the funds to my private account. The closing date? The day after our party. Elegant. Symmetrical. I spent the following days watching Daniel and Margaret bustle about like monarchs preparing for coronation. Margaret ordered new linens for her bedroom. Daniel made lists. He had a schedule printed and laminated, as if he were coordinating a royal wedding rather than a suburban soiree. And I waited. The party unfolded like a stage play, each actor performing their part. Daniel played the loving husband, Margaret, the wise matriarch. Guests floated through the rooms, oblivious to the storm clouds gathering in the quiet corners. When Daniel announced Margaret's permanent residency, I had already packed a box of essentials in the trunk of my car. Just in case, my passport, my journals, a USB drive with digital copies of everything, bank statements, sale contracts, account passwords. I wasn't just escaping, I was documenting. So as Margaret raised a glass to new beginnings, and Daniel basked in smug satisfaction, I quietly slipped away to my study. There, in a sleek manila folder, were the signed documents, the sale agreement, the check from Donna, the end of their plan. I waited until most of the guests had gone. Only Daniel, Margaret, and a few of their loyal lapdogs remained, chatting over champagne and laughing like hyenas. I walked into the room, folder in hand. "Daniel," I said, with a smile that didn't reach my eyes, "can we have a moment?" He looked confused, slightly annoyed at being pulled away from his captive audience. Margaret narrowed her eyes. Of course she followed. I led them into the kitchen. The overhead lights buzzed softly. The granite countertop gleamed. I placed the folder on the table and opened it slowly. "This," I said, pointing to the top document, "is a notarized sale agreement. I sold the house." Daniel stared at the papers, not comprehending. "You what?" he said, voice rising. "I sold the house. To Donna Reynolds. She takes ownership tomorrow." He looked like a man waking up mid-fall. "You can't do that." "I already did," Margaret hissed. "This house—" "Was in my name," I interrupted, turning to her with a smile. "Daniel signed it over last year for tax reasons, remember? That little loophole your accountant friend suggested?" Daniel was pale. Margaret sputtered like an engine without fuel. I leaned in. "You were planning to push me out, but I was never trapped, Daniel. I was just biding my time. The silence that followed was the sweetest sound I'd heard in years. What are you going to do? Margaret snapped. Where will you go? I shrugged. Somewhere warm, somewhere quiet. Somewhere you two will never find me. I turned to Daniel. I suggest you start packing. You have 24 hours to vacate. You can't just kick us out, he said, but there was no conviction in his voice. Just fear. I looked him in the eyes, steady and calm. Watch me. And with that, I walked upstairs, past the guests, past the champagne flutes, into what was once our bedroom. I closed the door, packed the last of my things into a suitcase, and let the weight of 17 years slide off my shoulders. That night, I didn't sleep. I didn't need to. For the first time in years, I wasn't trapped. I wasn't stuck in their version of my life. I was free, and I was just getting started. The next morning dawned gray and quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the heavy, suffocating stillness that hangs in the air just before a storm breaks. I stood by the window in the guest room, watching the mist snake its way around the hedges. The air was thick with finality. Downstairs, Daniel sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee, like nothing had happened, like he hadn't just lost everything. He was dressed in the same clothes from the night before. Shirt wrinkled, collar askew, eyes bloodshot. He held the mug like a lifeline, knuckles white. Margaret, on the other hand, was pacing. Her slippers thudded against the hardwood floor with the rhythm of a war drum. She muttered to herself, bits of sentences escaping under her breath like steam from a cracked kettle. Rage simmered in every step, every glare she shot toward the kitchen. I descended the stairs slowly, the manila folder still in my hand. Not because I needed it anymore, but because it grounded me, my evidence, my freedom. You knew this was coming, I said flatly, stepping into the kitchen doorway. You just didn't think I had it in me. Daniel looked up, startled by the sound of my voice. He tried to compose himself, setting down his mug and clearing his throat. Rachel, we can talk about this. Maybe we rushed things. Maybe this was all a misunderstanding. I almost laughed. No, Daniel. You did exactly what you wanted, and now so have I. Margaret appeared like a storm cloud behind him, her fury finally boiling over. You tricked us. You manipulated him. How could you do this to your own husband? I turned to her, calm and resolute. No, Margaret. I protected myself. Something I should have done a long time ago. Daniel stood up, suddenly defensive. I was trying to make it work. You don't understand the pressure I was under. Mom needed help, and you were always so distant. By giving her our bedroom? By making decisions behind my back? By putting her on the deed? My voice cracked like a whip. I found the draft, Daniel. I know everything. Margaret froze in her tracks. Wait, you said she agreed to that. Daniel's face went blank. I turned to her, pity softening the edge of my voice. He lied to you, too. That was the breaking point. Margaret turned on him like a switchblade, eyes narrowed into slits. You used me. You said she was unstable. You said this would be our home. Daniel raised his hands, as if fending off an invisible attack. Mom, it was just an idea. I didn't think. Exactly. You never think, Daniel, I said, stepping between them. You just do what's easiest. And you thought letting her bulldoze into our lives was easier than standing up for me. Silence followed. Thick, stretching, uncomfortable. For once, neither of them had anything to say. I set the folder on the counter and turned to face them fully. I had never felt taller. You have until the afternoon, I said, voice clear and strong. Donna will be here with the movers by 4. Margaret opened her mouth, then closed it. Her face crumpled and twisted, a mask of rage and disbelief. Daniel slumped back into the chair, the fight draining out of him like air from a balloon. He didn't even try to argue. Maybe he finally understood. Maybe he saw that this was not a negotiation. I stood there for a moment longer, letting the weight of my words settle into the walls, the floor, the very bones of the house. Then I turned and walked away, past the kitchen, past the remnants of the party, past the weight of 17 years. Upstairs, I changed into jeans and a soft white blouse. I tied my hair back and slipped into a pair of worn flats. I zipped up my suitcase and set it by the door. I didn't need much. I stood in the foyer and looked around one last time. The house that had held so many of my dreams and then so many of my disappointments. I didn't feel sorrow. I didn't feel regret. I felt clean, light. At 3:58 p.m., Donna arrived with the movers. They were swift, efficient, and silent. Daniel and Margaret lingered in the driveway, watching like ghosts exorcised from their own story. Margaret tried one last time to speak to me, her voice shrill and desperate. "You'll regret this. You'll be alone." I smiled at her, kind and unbothered. I'd rather be alone than invisible. Daniel didn't speak. He just looked at me, and for a moment, I thought I saw something genuine in his eyes. Not love, not sorrow, but recognition of what he'd lost, of who I really was. But it was too late for all of that. I handed the keys to Donna. She nodded at me, then turned to instruct the movers. I stepped into my car, started the engine, and pulled away from the curb without a single glance back. I had confronted them. I had reclaimed my voice. I had won. And I was only just beginning. Absolutely. Here's an expanded final chapter of your story, deepening character reflection, emotional closure, and the protagonist's journey to self-reclamation. This version brings it to around 2,500 words, while preserving and enriching your original tone and message. By sunset, they were gone. Margaret stormed out first, dragging a suitcase that bumped angrily down each porch step. Her mouth moved in a steady stream of condemnation, betrayal, ungratefulness, immaturity. The words didn't sting, not anymore. They drifted past me like smoke from a fire that had long burned out. Her car peeled out of the driveway like she was escaping something toxic, never realizing she was the one who had been spreading the poison. Daniel left more slowly, his gait hesitant, shoulders hunched, as if the gravity of what he was losing had just begun to dawn on him. He stood at the doorway, suitcase in one hand, coat in the other, looking back at me with wide, wounded eyes, expecting me to stop him, to say something, anything. But I didn't. I just watched. Not with anger, not with grief. Just a quiet kind of finality. Something resolute had settled inside me. I didn't cry, I didn't rage, I didn't gloat. I closed the door. Donna arrived the next morning with her real estate team, cheerful and businesslike, her sharp heels tapping confidently on the tile floor. Papers were signed, keys exchanged. Her assistant complimented the light fixtures, and someone else made a joke about how fast the house would sell. I smiled, nodded, let them talk. The truth was, I wasn't sad to let go of the house. It had never truly been mine. Not really. It was something Daniel had picked, big enough for his ambitions, tasteful enough for Margaret's standards. A house full of Pottery Barn throws and restoration hardware furniture, arranged to impress visitors we never really liked. I used to wander its rooms and wonder how I'd ended up there, like waking up in the middle of someone else's dream. I moved into a two-bedroom condo on the edge of town. It was smaller, sleeker, filled, with clean lines and warm light. No sprawling kitchen, no manicured lawn, no walk-in closet the size of a small country. But it had something far more valuable: freedom. I painted the walls myself. I picked shades of deep navy and soft olive and dusty pink, colors that would have horrified Margaret and baffled Daniel. I bought secondhand furniture that I loved for no reason other than it made me smile. My bookshelf came alive again, stuffed with novels and memoirs I'd once hidden in storage boxes labeled ** seasonal decor. I started freelancing. Slowly, cautiously, I took on small design projects, logos for local bakeries, interior mock-ups for cozy cafes, branding packages for startup florists. My first client paid me in both cash and a dozen cupcakes, and I cried in the parking lot. Not from the money, but from the feeling of being seen, needed, capable. Daniel tried to call. Once. Then again. Then he emailed. The subject line was always the same. *, can we talk? Inside, there were paragraphs, some pleading, some apologizing. He missed me. He didn't know what he was thinking. Margaret had moved in with his sister, and both were furious with him. He was miserable. He wanted to start over. I read every word. Then I deleted them. Because it was too late. In the quiet that followed, something extraordinary happened. I started to hear myself again. At first, it was subtle, like hearing your own voice echo in a canyon after shouting into it for years and getting only silence back. I began to remember what I liked. I lit sandalwood candles just because I liked the scent, not because they matched a seasonal theme. I played jazz while I cooked instead of Daniel's endless playlists of moody ambient noise. I laughed out loud at my own jokes, alone in my kitchen, and found that I liked my company. I took myself out to dinner, to movies, to parks where I could sit under trees and read without having to justify my time. I learned to enjoy the rhythm of solitude, its soft contours and generous silences. No one to perform for, no one to shrink for. One day, I came across an old photo while unpacking a box I'd ignored for months. It was of me, years ago, at a music festival. My hair wild, my smile easy, arms thrown around two friends I hadn't spoken to in years. I stared at that version of myself for a long time. She looked alive, unburdened. It occurred to me then that I hadn't really lost anything when Daniel walked out. I had only regained what I had forgotten. Myself. People ask me sometimes what happened with Daniel. Old friends, coworkers who hadn't kept up, people from our old neighborhood who still sent Christmas cards out of obligation. I smile and say, we grew apart. It's easier than explaining the slow erosion of identity, easier than recounting the subtle humiliations, the dinners where I was told to let Daniel talk, the family vacations where I was barely tolerated, the nights I lay awake beside someone who didn't know me and didn't want to. It's easier than describing the loneliness of being in love with someone who loved only the idea of you, the edited version, the agreeable one, the silent partner. Besides, I'm not interested in bitterness. The truth is, Daniel didn't ruin me. He revealed me. Or rather, my leaving him did. In walking away, I rediscovered the shape of my own life, unbent from the mold of someone else's expectations. And once I saw it clearly, I could never go back. The woman I am now does not beg to be understood. She does not measure her worth by her usefulness or her agreeableness. She wears what she likes, speaks when she wants, and no longer apologizes for taking up space. She has discovered the joy of saying no, the power of choosing herself. Last week, I went to an art exhibit alone. There was a piece there, a sculpture made of mirrors and broken porcelain. It reflected the viewer in hundreds of fragmented ways, distorted and beautiful and strange. I stood before it for a long time, and for the first time in years, I didn't flinch at what I saw. I didn't want to fix it. I wanted to know it. I wanted to love it. There's a new man at the cafe I visit every Sunday. He's kind, soft-spoken. He asked if I'd like to join him sometime. I told him I would think about it, and I did. For a while. But the truth is, I don't feel any urgency to say yes, because I'm not waiting for someone to complete me. I'm already whole. There are nights I sit on my condo balcony, feet curled under me, sipping chamomile tea as the city hums softly around me. And I think of the woman I used to be, the one who kept quiet to avoid conflict, who edited her dreams to fit someone else's narrative, who mistook endurance for love. I send her gratitude, because she survived long enough for me to be born. In the mirror now, I see someone steady and bright, someone who knows how to be alone without being lonely, someone who laughs louder and feels deeper and no longer hides her light to soothe someone else's shadow. The woman in the mirror isn't just surviving, she's finally living.